The gate was stiff that morning. It always was in October, the cold working into the hinge pins overnight and swelling the iron so the latch wouldn't seat right until the sun had been up an hour or two. I'd been meaning to fix it since August. I was standing there working at it with the heel of my hand when I saw her come over the ridge. I didn't know her. That was the first thing I noticed. Because I knew everybody on that road, the Garner boys who ran cattle on the north pasture, old Prentice with his buckboard, the circuit preacher who came through in May and September. Whoever this woman was, she wasn't from around here, and she was coming from the east, which meant she'd come up through the canyon road, and nobody came up through the canyon road unless they meant to come here. There was nowhere else to go. I watched her for a moment without moving. She was on foot, walking steady. She had a good walk, not hurried, not tentative. The walk of somebody who'd covered ground before and didn't mind covering more. She was dressed for travel, not for visiting. Coat the color of creek mud, boots that had seen mud in them. Her hair was back and she wasn't looking at the ground. She was looking ahead, which was at me. I let go of the gate. Then I saw what was behind her. My father gave me my first dog when I was 6. A cattle dog with one ear that stood up and one that flopped. The flopped one from an argument with a coyote before she came to us, my father said, though the scar was old enough I couldn't tell. She was 4 years older than me and she worked cattle for another 6 after that, and then she died under the porch in the spring, quiet as a rained-out fire, and I buried her out by the creek. Her name was Cora, though I don't know who named her first. By the time she was mine, she was just Cora. I tell you that because the first animal behind the woman was a cattle dog. Blue Merle, one ear that flopped. Not the same dog. Cora had been in the ground 30 years, but enough like her that I stood there with my hand on the gate post and felt something unhinge in my chest before my mind had caught up to what I was seeing. That was the moment. That was when I understood this was going to be a different kind of morning. I should tell you about the land first. About what kind of place this was, and what kind of man it made. My grandfather built the main house in 1871, one room with a sleeping loft, hauling timber out of the canyon by mule because there was no road then. My father added the barn and the 2 back rooms when he married. I added nothing. That's not self-pity, it's just accurate. I inherited a good piece of ground and I kept it. I ran cattle on the upper pastures and I kept a small horse operation in the lower paddock, and every year I broke even or near enough to it. And that was what the place asked of me, and that was what I gave. I had no wife. I'd been close to it once, a woman in Laramie who'd come out to her uncle's spread for a summer, and for about 4 months I thought something was going to come of it. Then her uncle sold the spread and she went back east, and I got a letter in November that was kind, and explained that she was going to marry a man in Philadelphia who worked in a bank. I didn't write back. There wasn't anything to say that the letter hadn't already settled. After that I kept to the work. The land and the cattle and the horses and the dogs, and the seasons that moved through the way seasons do, and the quiet that accumulates when you live alone long enough that you stop noticing it's quiet. You stop expecting it to be otherwise. I'd had over the years a lot of dogs, a lot of horses. Some stayed, some went. I was not a man who held on to things when the thing wanted to go, an animal with its own nature, and you can't cage a nature without breaking it, and breaking things was not something I had any interest in. So they came when they came and they went when they went, and I thought that was the arrangement. It turned out the arrangement was something else. She stopped about 10 yards from the gate and she looked at me straight. I'd stopped pretending to work on the latch by then. There was no point. "You Dellard," she said, "John Dellard." "That's right," I said. She nodded like that settled something. She had gray in her hair, not old, maybe 45, but a woman who'd had some weather. There were lines around her eyes that weren't from squinting. She had a directness to her that I noticed because I have it myself, and I'm used to people not having it. "My name is Ruth Cairn," she said. I had a farm about 22 miles east of here, down in the valley past the Hollies Creek Junction. Do you know it? I know where the junction is, I said. I don't know the farm. You don't need to, I sold it last spring. She paused, then she said, I found your dog. I looked at the cattle dog standing behind her left knee, watching me with the intensity cattle dogs have, like they're calculating something. He's not mine, I said. I haven't had a cattle dog in, I stopped, thought, 3 years. He had your mark on him, she said. Notched left ear, Dellard's mark. Notched ear is my mark, I said, but I've passed dogs along. If I couldn't keep them or they needed more work than I had. I stopped again, because she was watching me in a way that meant she'd already figured out what I was about to figure out. That's what I thought, she said, so I went looking. She turned then and she put 2 fingers in her mouth, and she whistled not a loud whistle, a particular one, 2 notes in a certain pattern, and from behind the ridge, from behind the lip of the road where it bent down toward the canyon, they started coming up. I know now there were 11 of them. At the time I couldn't count. They came up over the ridge the way a dream comes over you when you're half awake, one thing and then another and then more, and your mind is still trying to hold the first thing while the second arrives. A bay mare. 2 dogs. A buckskin gelding with the white sock on his left rear that I put there myself. That sock was a distinctive thing, a perfect clean line like somebody had painted it. A mule. 3 more dogs, all with something of my mark on them, notched ear or a particular training, the way they sat and held when she stopped. An old roan with a gray muzzle who was moving slower than the others, favoring his left front slightly, and who I recognized before I could have said why. I recognized him because I'd ridden him for 6 years, and he'd thrown me twice, and I'd trusted him in the mountains in weather that would have ruined a lesser horse. And then I'd let him go to man in Casper who'd said he needed a good, reliable horse, and I'd taken the man's word that he'd give the animal a decent rest in his later years. The roan's name was Chester, which was a stupid name for a horse, and I knew it even when I gave it to him. But by the time I knew it, the name had stuck. Chester looked at me from across the yard. Then he walked forward, slow, favoring the foot, until his nose was at my shoulder, and he breathed out through his nostrils the way horses do and stood there. I put my hand on his neck. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to a horse. You don't explain yourself to them, and they don't ask you to. Ruth Cairn stood back and let me look. That was the first thing I understood about her. She had the sense to give a man room to take in a thing without filling the space with talking. She just waited, her hands in her coat pockets, her eyes moving over the yard and the barn and the house with the interest of someone who understands land. She wasn't assessing it as property. She was reading it the way you read a man's face, looking at what the years had put there. I walked along the string slowly. Each animal I touched or didn't. The mule I hadn't seen in 8 years. I'd traded him to a freighter who was heading up toward Montana, a young man who'd needed a reliable pack animal, and who I'd thought would do right by him. He was older now, gray coming in around his ears, but his eyes were clear. He stood steady while I put my hand on his side and felt his ribs, which were fine, which meant someone had been keeping him right. The dogs circled me in the way trained dogs circle when they're not sure yet if you're in charge or not. I stood still and let them come to me, and they did, one by one, and I found my mark on each of them, not always the ear notch, because some of them had come to me already marked, but the training. The way they sat to a signal. The way they held their ground. A man's hand is in the work he does, and these animals had my hand in them, and I could feel it as clearly as you feel your own grip. How long did this take you? I asked without turning around. 7 months, Ruth said. I turned at that. 7 months, I said again. Some of them were easy to find, she said. Your neighbors knew who you'd sold to mostly. Some of those sales had passed along to somebody else. The mule took me the longest. He'd gone through 3 hands since you let him go. The last man who had him was up in Sheridan. She paused. I drove to Sheridan. I looked at her. She was not a woman who said things to be impressive. She said it the same way she'd said everything else, matter of fact, like it was simply the sequence of events. "Why?" I said. She thought about that for a moment, which I respected. She wasn't going to give me a quick answer. "Because somebody should," she said finally, "and because nobody had. I should tell you about the blue merle first, the dog. I'd found him in the fall 5 years back. He'd been in the road when I came down from the high pasture, just sitting there in the middle of the track like he was waiting on a stage. No collar, ribs showing enough to be a concern. He was young, maybe 2 years, and he had that look dogs get when they've been working and then suddenly aren't, the look of an animal whose purpose has been taken from him. Confused and ready at the same time. I named him Wick because he lit up when you talked to him. He was with me for a year and a half. Best cattle dog I'd had since Cora, maybe better, because he was smarter and faster, and had the instinct so deep in him it was like a religion. He worked with the kind of joy you want to see in any creature, running not because you told him to, but because the running itself was the point, the thing he'd been made for. Then my neighbor Frank Halsey's operation expanded, and Frank came over one afternoon and we talked, and Frank's problem was that he had no dog worth keeping and I had more dog than I needed for what I was running. The calculus was plain. I gave Wick to Frank. Frank died 2 winters later. Heart. His widow sold the ranch and moved to Denver, and I assumed Wick went somewhere in that dispersal, to one of Frank's hands, or sold off with the working dogs, or passed along to whoever bought the cattle. I didn't inquire. It felt like inquiring would have been hoping for something I didn't have the right to hope for. And now here he was. Ruth Cairn had found him on a ranch outside of Dubois, working somebody else's herd, doing exactly what he'd been made to do, with my mark notched in his left ear and my training in every signal he obeyed. He was sitting at Ruth's heel now, watching me with the calculation that was just his nature. I crouched down and held out my hand, and he came to me with his whole body moving, which was the thing I'd always loved about him. He didn't give you a little of himself. He gave you all of it. I held his face in my hands, and he let me. "Coffee?" I said to Ruth Cairn, standing up. It wasn't a question. I didn't know yet what kind of woman she was, but she'd driven to Sheridan for a mule, and that was enough. "Yes," she said, in the same tone I'd said it. Not a question either. I got the animals into the paddock and the barn while she waited on the porch, and then I put the water on, and she came inside and sat down at the kitchen table without being asked, which I also noted. A person who doesn't wait to be invited to sit down either has no manners or has a quality of ease that's rarer and better than manners. She had the second kind. She looked at the house the way she'd looked at the land, the same reading. "You built the addition yourself," she said. It wasn't a question either. "My grandfather built the main room," I said. "My father added 2 rooms east. I added the porch and the back wall." "I thought so," she said. "You can see where the different hands worked." "Most people couldn't see that." I looked at her. "You had land," I said. "Had," she said. "Valley Farm, 20 acres, cattle and some chickens. My husband and I started it. He died 6 years ago. I ran it 4 years by myself, and then I sold it because 20 acres alone is a lot of ground for one person." "Yes, it is," I said. "You run this alone," she said. "I do." "How big?" "About 400 usable. Some of it's canyon that doesn't work for much." She absorbed that without comment, which was the right response. There was nothing to say to it. 400 acres alone is either impressive or sad depending on who's looking at it, and I suspected Ruth Cairn was the kind of woman who looked at it and saw it plain, which was neither. I poured the coffee. She wrapped both hands around the cup, which meant she was cold, which made sense. She'd walked 22 miles of canyon road in October. "You walked the whole way," I said. "I had a horse," she said. "She went lame just before the canyon junction. I left her at the Prentice place." She said it without apology, The horse went lame, she walked. That was the sequence. I'll go back for her tomorrow. I thought about that. A woman who'd spent 7 months gathering my animals would leave her own horse at a neighbor's and walk the rest of the way rather than delay the day she was supposed to arrive. I didn't say anything about it. There wasn't anything to say about it that the fact didn't already say better. The buckskin gelding, I'd called him Emery, which was the name of a creek I'd camped on once in Wyoming that I'd always liked, I'd let go to a family out of Douglas. The father wanted a steady horse his kids could learn on, and Emery was steady as ground. Reliable, no bad habits, patient in the way that certain animals are patient, which is not like human patience, not an effort, just a nature. I'd thought about that horse occasionally over the years. Not pined for him, I'm not built for pining, but thought about him the way you think about a decision you made honestly and don't regret but still turn over now and then. He was a horse worth turning over. Not because he was exceptional only in being so consistently what he was, but because letting him go had felt like letting go of something trustworthy, which is different from letting go of something flashy or valuable. You can replace flashy. You don't replace trustworthy so easily. He was standing in my paddock now in the October light with his white sock clear as a brand, eating the hay I'd thrown and not looking at me. That was a trustworthy horse. He didn't need to look at me. He was just there. I stood at the paddock fence for a while with my coffee going cold in my hand, and I thought about the chain of hands that horse had passed through, the family in Douglas, and whoever they'd sold to, and whoever after that, until Ruth Cairn had gotten hold of his trail and followed it to wherever it ended and put him in the string that walked up over my ridge this morning. 7 months. Inside, we talked for a while about nothing that mattered and everything that did. She'd grown up in Nebraska. Her husband had been a good man. She said it plainly, without grief or performance, the way you say a true thing about someone you're done mourning. She'd sold the farm to a young couple from back east who had ideas, which she said with no meanness in it. She was between places now, which was why she'd had time for the project. You planned it, I asked. I had a winter to think about it, she said. After I sold, I was boarding with a cousin in Rawlins and I had time and I needed something to do with it. She looked at her cup. I found your notch mark first on the cattle dog at a spread outside Casper. The man there said he'd got him from a man in Casey who'd got him from somewhere else. I started asking backwards. And you just kept going, I said. It was interesting, she said, which was not what I'd expected her to say. Every animal had a story behind it, where it had been, who'd had it, and they all had your mark somewhere or your training or both. It was like following a thread. She paused. You don't hold on to things. No, I said. Why not? I thought about that. It was a direct question and it deserved a direct answer, and I hadn't been asked it before, not in those words. Because the thing is more important than the having of it, I said finally. A good dog on good ground, a steady horse with a family that needs steady. The animal matters more than whether I'm the one who has it. She looked at me for a moment. Not measuring, she'd already taken my measure or she wouldn't have come this far. Something else. That's not a small thing to understand, she said. It's just true, I said. Most people don't know it, she said. I didn't argue with that. I didn't have enough evidence to argue with it. The roan, Chester, had been mine longer than any of the others. 12 years, from when he was 4 until he was 16, and in those 12 years he'd carried me through 2 bad winters and a mountain crossing in weather that should have killed both of us and a spring flood that had taken the lower fence and half the herd, and that had been the worst spring of my life by some distance. He'd been under me for all of it. A horse that age, that steady, that far into your life, is not a horse you own so much as a horse you know. The knowing is different from the owning. I'd let him go because I'd thought he deserved easier years than I could give him, and the man in Casper had seemed right for it. He'd had a small spread and an easygoing manner, and he'd talked about the horse with the respect you want to hear a man use. I'd believed him. I went into the barn while Ruth rinsed the cups at the bucket, and I stood with Chester in his stall and put my forehead against his neck the way I used to when we'd come off the mountain, and I was tired enough to need the contact. He smelled like hay and old sweat, and the particular smell that was just him, which I hadn't thought about in 3 years, but which was right there the second I was close enough. He was 21 now, old for a working horse. His feet were okay, I'd checked them when I brought him in, and his teeth were what you'd expect. The left front he was favoring was stiffness in the fetlock, not structural, and a winter's rest and some careful work might ease it. He wasn't going to work cattle again, but he was here. That was what I had trouble with, standing there in the stall with the October cold coming through the barn boards. Not the sentiment of it, I'm not sentimental, or not only that but the plain fact. He was here. Ruth Cairn had found him in Casper and decided he belonged back, and she had been right, and she'd come 22 miles through Canyon Road on a horse that went lame on the last stretch, and she'd brought him home. I hadn't known he needed to come home, that was the part. I hadn't let myself think in those terms because I'd made my peace with the arrangement, and I'm a man who makes his peace, and then holds to it. But standing there with Chester's weight against my palm and the other animals moving in the paddock outside, I understood that I'd been operating on a kind of lack that I hadn't named, and that Ruth Cairn had named it and then fixed it without being asked. She was on the porch when I came out, sitting in the chair my father had made, a good chair, ash wood, that had weathered 40 years of porch weather and was still solid, and looking out at the paddock where the animals were settling. The light was getting to that late afternoon angle where the whole valley goes copper, the kind of light that makes everything look like a memory before it's even over. I sat in the other chair, the one I'd made myself, and that was decent but not as good as my father's, and we watched the paddock together without talking. After a while she said, "What will you do with all of them?" "Keep what I can use," I said. "Find good places for the rest. The same as before, I suppose, except this time I'll know who I'm giving them to a little better." "You knew who you were giving them to before," she said, not arguing, just correcting. "I thought I did," I said. "Some of them ended up well," she said. "More than you'd expect." She paused. "Most of the chains were short. 1 or 2 hands, then settled somewhere with decent people. The mule in Sheridan was the outlier. He'd been through too many." "How was he when you found him?" "Thin," she said. "Not bad, thin and a little too careful around strangers. He's easier now. He settled down on the road." I thought about that. A mule who'd been through too many hands, getting easier on the road back. Something about that seemed right in a way I didn't want to make too much of. "You're good with animals," I said. "I'm good at reading them," she said. "It's not the same thing." "It's most of it," I said. She accepted that without false modesty, which I appreciated. The question I should have asked was why. I'd asked it once and she'd said because somebody should and because nobody had, and that was a true answer, but it wasn't the whole answer, and we both knew it. I didn't ask again because she'd tell me when she was ready or she wouldn't, and pressing a person who has given you back 11 animals and walked the last 5 miles of the road doesn't seem right. What I thought, sitting in the copper light while the mule leaned against the paddock fence and Wick ran a small perimeter around the yard, the way cattle dogs do when they're settling into a place. What I thought was that Ruth Cairn was a woman of particular intelligence who'd had a hard winter with too much time in it, and that the project had been real, but it had been more than just the project. A person who follows a thread for 7 months, who drives to Sheridan for a mule, who walks the last 5 miles of a canyon road when her horse goes lame, that person is following something more than a notched ear mark. I knew that the same way I know what the weather's doing 3 days out, not from evidence you can point to, just from having paid attention long enough. I let it alone, there was time. She stayed for dinner because it was getting late and the Prentice place was 3 miles back, and there was no point in her walking it in the dark. I cooked what I had, which was not elaborate beans and salt pork and cornbread, and the last of the summer apples stewed with a little sugar, and she ate it without comment, which was the right response to that kind of food. It wasn't food you commented on, you just ate it. We talked about the land. She had opinions about land, good ones, the kind that come from having worked it rather than having read about it. She knew what canyon soil was good for and what it wasn't. She knew about winter water rights. She knew about the particular stubbornness of range cattle when they'd spent too long on the same ground and needed moving. I found myself talking more than I usually did. Not performing, I'm not capable of that and wouldn't want to be, but talking because the conversation was worth talking in. Because she asked questions that were actually questions, not openers for something she wanted to say. Because she listened the way she looked at land, with attention that was about the thing and not about herself. I hadn't talked like that I thought about it later, when she was in the back room and I was banking the fire. I hadn't talked like that since before the Laramie woman. Before I'd gotten used to the quiet being the only thing I'd get. I banked the fire slowly, working the coals to hold through the night. Wick was curled near the hearth, which was where he'd always slept when he lived here. Like he remembered, or like he didn't need to remember because it was just where he went. Chester was in the barn. The mule and the others were in the paddock, and they'd be all right because the cold wasn't hard yet and I'd thrown enough hay. I sat in my chair for a while without lighting the lamp. Let the fire do what it did. What I thought about was the size of it. Not in terms of sentiment, I've said I'm not sentimental, or not only, but in terms of plain fact. 11 animals. 11 lives I'd touched and let go. Each one I'd cared for and moved on from, thinking that was the shape of the thing, thinking the arrangement was. You tend, you give away, you tend again. That the giving away was the end of it. It turned out the giving away was not the end of it. It turned out there was a woman in Nebraska who'd had a hard winter and started pulling a thread, and the thread went through Casper and Casey and Dubois and all the way up to Sheridan, and at the end of every strand there was something I'd given away that still had my mark on it. My notch, my training, my hand in the work, all of it still there, like I'd signed it. I hadn't known I'd left that much of myself in the world. I hadn't thought about it in those terms. You do the work and you let it go and you don't account for what remains. But Ruth Cairn had accounted for it. She'd gone out and found every piece of it and brought it back, and she'd walked the last 5 miles when her horse went lame because that was the kind of woman she was. Because she decided the accounting mattered and she was going to see it through. That is not a small thing. To be seen that clearly. To have someone look at the scattered evidence of your life and decide it was worth gathering. In the morning she was up before me, which I wouldn't have expected but maybe should have. She had the water on, and she was sitting at the table with her coat already on and her boots laced, which told me she was ready to go back for her horse. You didn't have to start the water, I said. I was awake, she said, and I know how to use a stove. I poured my cup and stood at the window and looked at the paddock where the animals were moving in the early light. Chester had come out of the barn and was standing near the fence, which was his way. "Where are you going after Rollins?" I said. It was the question I should have asked the night before. I'd let it lie because there was time, and now there was less of it. She didn't answer immediately. She held her cup. "I haven't decided," she said. "Between places," I said. "Still between places," she said. I turned from the window. "The canyon road's no good in November," I said. "Too much ice in the low sections. If somebody wanted to come back up in the spring, the ground would be easier." I stopped. "I've got fence work that wants 2 pairs of hands," I added, which was true and also was not the point. She looked at me, the same way she'd looked at the house and the land, reading it plain. "You're not good at this," she said. "No," I said. "Neither am I," she said. "I'm just better at walking toward things." She was. 7 months and 22 miles proved it. I'm the kind of man who makes peace with the arrangement and holds to it, and sometimes that's a virtue, and sometimes it's just what you tell yourself. She was the kind of woman who looked at a loose end and followed it all the way to wherever it went. The kind who goes to Sheridan for a mule. "Spring," I said. "Spring," she said. That was the whole of it. That was enough. She left mid-morning after the light had warmed enough to make the road decent. I walked her out to the gate. The hinge was still stiff. I was going to fix it today, finally. And she had the blue Merle with her because she had 3 miles to the Prentice place and Wick was a dog that needed to be moving. At the gate she stopped and she handed me the lead rope she'd been carrying folded in her pocket. It was a plain cotton lead, old and soft from use, and she held it out the way you hand somebody something that belongs to them. I took it. She looked at me the way she'd been looking at things all morning, at the house and the land and the animals. But this time it was just me, and I let her, because that was the whole point. 7 months of following a thread through 4 states. That's what it costs to make a man stand still long enough to be looked at. "You left a lot of good things in the world," she said, "more than most." I didn't say anything. She wasn't asking for a response. She was just saying the true thing the way she did. Then she turned and walked with her good walk, not hurried, not tentative, down the road toward the canyon junction, with Wick working the edges of the road ahead of her, and the October light coming off the valley in that clean, cold way it has, and I stood at the stiff gate with the old lead rope in my hand and watched her go. I fixed the gate that afternoon. And in the spring, when the canyon road was easy, she came back. She brought 3 books in her saddlebag and her good practical sense and her way of reading things plain, and she didn't ask for much and neither did I, and that turned out to be exactly right. We worked the fence in April, and by May the rhythm was there. The 2 of us moving around the land the way 2 people do when they know how to give each other room. Wick ran his perimeter. Chester stood in the paddock and didn't need to look at us. The mule worked the south pasture with the patience of an old hand. I don't know what the word is for a man who spent 30 years giving the best parts of himself away and then watched a woman walk them back up his own road. I don't have a word for that. But I know what it felt like to hold that lead rope and understand, finally, completely, too late in the season to be embarrassed about it, that you hadn't been losing things after all. You'd been putting them somewhere, and a good woman had known where they were the whole time.